Everyone, welcome. This is Eugene here, and this is going to be episode 80 of Forensics Talks. Today, my guest is David Larraguibel. He's a forensic photographer at the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service, and we are going to be speaking to him about the role of photography in post-mortem examinations. Now, first off, like always, I want people to say hello. Let me know where you're from. I know there's going to be a few people here from different parts of the world because some people contacted me and said they were going to be joining in, which is great. So yeah, just let me know what's going on and where you're from. Always good to know. Also, shout out to all the people on the Recon 3D course, which was a couple of weeks ago. Thank you very much. And a couple of announcements with respect to training courses. So the first one is going to be next week. Let me just share this here. So this is going to be a photography course that's going to be coming up. So if you're using a digital camera already and you're not familiar with photogrammetry, this will be a great way to get started and allow you to create 3D models using your digital camera and some software. We're going to be using a package called 3DF Zephyr. It's a great package. There's a whole bunch of stuff. You can use it with drones. You can use it with your phone. You can use it with a digital SLR, whatever you have. And if you're interested in that, you just have to go to that link there at my website. It's just on the training page, and March 14th and 15th, 2 days next week, 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. each day. And it is also being recorded. I know sometimes there are people from other parts of the world who do not have the, sort of the right timing. You don't want to be up at 3 in the morning trying to do a photogrammetry class. So the recording allows you to do the assignments and watch the training and everything else and still get a certificate for the class. Now, the other one that's going to be coming up here is the Recon 3D user group meeting. So let me just see if I can switch to that. There we go. So that's coming up on March 21st. And let me put the link here. So if you go to the training page on the recon-3d.com, that is where we're going to be having the very first user group meeting. So we're going to be bringing a lot of users together to discuss and talk about, using the app, best practices, accuracy studies, tips and tricks, all kinds of things there. So by all means, if you can, please join in, and you may enjoy it. You may learn something new. Okay. And let's see here. What else do I got on the list here? Oh, yeah, I keep forgetting. So the Forensics Talks program, as of some time ago, has been turned into a podcast. So I am trying to push people more to look at the podcast. So whether you're on Apple or Google or Spotify, whatever it might be, look for Forensics Talks. And if you can, just subscribe or add it to your library or whatever. I basically take all of these talks and then I condense them. Obviously, these are live. So right now, as I'm speaking, I cut out the intro and I kind of get right to the actual interview and, cut out any, sometimes when the internet flakes out or whatever, I try to clean all that up. And it's a great way to listen while you're driving or while you're working. So make sure that you jump onto that. All right. Well, enough talking here. Let's get to this, and we're going to start. So here we go. So David Larraguibel, he is a graduate of the Ontario College of Art and Design University as part of the Integrated Media Program. And he built his expertise in photography, digital imaging, and content production within creative industries in a variety of technical roles. He joined the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service in 2011, where he's responsible for photographic documentation of post-mortem examinations, specializing in the use of cross-polarization and infrared photography. He's also provided training for forensic pathologists and technical teams, sexual assault nurse examiners, municipal, provincial, federal, and military police services. And he's currently examining the potential for use of computational photography to generate 3D representations of forensic findings at autopsy, as well as for the postmortem identification, reconstruction, and virtual archiving of human remains. Now, David has been a past speaker at the Forensic Photography Symposium, which I held. The first one was a couple of years ago. And his first talk was on cross-polarization, infrared, UV, but really focusing on the cross-polarization methods, which I want to touch on today. But this past year, he was the keynote speaker. And I think he did a really great job of sort of highlighting what some of the challenges are in postmortem photography. So let's get to it. I'm going to bring him in here. And there he is. Hey, Dave, how you doing?
Hey, thanks for having me, Eugene.
All right. Awesome. Well, look, Dave, we've known each other, I guess, since, I don't know, it's been like 10 years or something like that.
We met in 2012.
Well, there you go. See, it's even longer. Uh,
Yeah.
and I remember at the time when I met you, I knew there was something sort of special about you, and I think it has to do with your passion for photography. Really, there are people that use photography as kind of part of their work, and maybe it's just another tool for them. But I
Mhm.
always feel like with you, it's something that you really take into heart, something that you really run with, something you've dived in very, very deep. So is that something that started off, like, were you planning when you first were at school, like this is what you were going to do?
No, no
No.
whatsoever. It's getting into forensic photography. The My path in was through the side door. I in high school decided pretty early on that I wanted to try my hand at being an artist, kind of in technical fields. So I attended OCAD U. It was just OCAD back then, so it wasn't a university at downtown Toronto, and it was a hell of a ride. We discussed death on theoretical and abstract basis. A lot of critical theory, cultural theory, trying to really understand what the meaning of death is and its application to art. But while I was there, my focus was shifting towards art and technology, and strangely enough, the human body. Um, so during my thesis year, my thesis turned out to be focusing on using photography to document the body, and the idea that it's a record keeper, both of physical and emotional, psychological trauma. And I did not in any way anticipate that that was the direction I'd wind up taking like 10, 15 years later. But when I had returned to OCAD to complete the degree portion, because, like I said, it wasn't a university at the time, I just happened to be passing through the admissions office and saw on the job board that there was a posting for forensic photographer. And I was in the process of pivoting away from the creative industries. Like, I'd worked for a few startups, technical roles, like a technical director, video editor, those kinds of things. But just I wasn't feeling it. It was, in the end, it really did keep coming back to making money, and I wanted to find a way to apply what I was learning, and what I had done, to public service. And so it just, very serendipitous. I saw it, applied. It really didn't think I had gotten it until a month and a half later, and at that point discovered that I would be the first forensic photographer for the province of Ontario in that role, in the newly minted OFPS. So it was a big surprise, but it was. I guess in a way it was an interesting way to bring it all back together. So my passion for photography wound up kind of really taking off at that point. I was leveraging it more for personal expression, as a way to kind of, I guess, talk about the things I was interested in while doing my other day job. And this was the first time I was able to merge them together. And but getting in that door was, I mean, I was an artist among scientists. I was by far the least educated person in the room, and the learning curve was pretty steep. So, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was, I guess that would have been at the old building
yes,
when
yeah,
we had first met. Yeah, and now, of course, you got like a new facility and stuff
yeah.
like that. So, 10 years is a decade, and I'm just curious about maybe some of the changes that have happened with either your role, if you're doing the same thing, if
Oh
you've
wow.
taken on different responsibilities. Like, what sort of happened in those 10 years?
Oh, where to begin? I mean, the big change actually happened 2 years before I started in '09. Was the creation of the OFPS. So that the creation came about through legislative change. There was a big court case. I won't get into it too much here, but if anyone's interested in googling the gouge inquiry surrounding the appeals process and investigation of uh, particular pathologists who had testified as an expert witness in a field he was not qualified to testify in. A lot of people went to prison, were wrongly convicted, and our now chief was one of the primary people responsible for testifying in this process. And so, as a result of the gouge inquiry, the gouge report was written, and legislative changes were implemented, and the creation of the OFPS as a separate body from the Office of the Chief Coroner. So an independent but closely related organization was formed. And so when the OFPS was created, drawing on those legislative requirements, one of the things that was found was the increased need for better reviewability. And so they hired a photographer. And so the changes really was that a photographer existed at all. Prior to that, it was just police. And so because of that, the photography that existed for each case was spotty. It was not consistent. There was no routine set of photos documented for every case. And so right off the bat, me asking is, so what do you need? Because I don't know what I'm doing. I know how to take a photo, but I don't know what you as an organization, I don't know what the public needs from me. So one of the biggest changes was standardizing the processes. So all the other lab processes were already in progress of standardization, but photography, nobody there knew what they needed or what to do. And so that's kind of where I started to really leverage the technical and I guess engineering focused parts of my brain and applied it towards the creative aspects that I had spent years just developing on my own. And so the changes since then was we got a new building. Also, one of the outcomes of that inquiry was dumping a ton of money into the death investigation system in Ontario. So that led to the creation of the Forensic Science and Forensic Science and Coroners Complex, the FSCC. So it was a $500 million building that houses the Center of Forensic Sciences, the Office of the Chief Coroner, the Ontario Forensic Pathology Service, Emergency Management Ontario, and the Office of the Fire Marshal. So we all kind of worked together in that building. And so that was one massive change, is now we had access to resources. We were able to implement on-site magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, computed tomography, CT, and we were given the money that we needed to buy the equipment that we were going to use for the next potentially 50 years. When the cases started scaling up to a point where I couldn't keep up anymore, we thankfully determined that a second photographer would be needed. So that was around 2015. So now I had to try and pivot to working in a team. We just continued to develop our processes and further refined how we were going to do them. The inclusion, I guess, of additional types of photography, so IR, cross-polarization, that started at the old building, but I didn't know how to use it yet, and nobody knew what the hell I was doing. So they just kind of trusted that I was going to learn to implement whatever it was that I was doing. I was, like I said, I was the artist among scientists, so they just kind of left me alone in that respect. But when we were able to start delivering results with what we did, I think there was definitely more trust given to the process. So changes is that we've grown. We've already outgrown the building, actually.
Yeah, really.
We're trying to find space, so we're up to 4 photographers now, and that's still not enough. So
I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, the last episode, I had Dr. Richard Shepard, who is a pathologist from the UK. And, he was talking about, pathologist's role and kind of what he was doing. But, in his books and as part of his work, and even in the cases, there's always a photographer there, like by his side and, in the room, taking photos and assisting. But what isn't clear is exactly where that photographer is from, if it's actually somebody like you that's belongs to the pathology service, or if it's a police officer. And you raised a really good point too, in the quality of the images, because in my casework, I've had those those times where you get the autopsy photos and you cringe. You're like, who took these photos? Like, what were they thinking? So if the quality of what you're doing, because you're there, is sort of elevated, those photos are so important afterwards, because people use them not just for, hey, hey, look, or whatever. Sometimes they're used as a record for analysis. They're used at trials and things like that. So it's are you sort of in a special position, or are there other places that are doing
Yeah.
that have the same sort of setup?
Well, strangely, in Ontario, we're currently the only service that has a specific role for a forensic photography technologist. Is what my role is called. The OFPS is actually made up of several regional units. So we're at the FSCC. A lot of acronyms being thrown around. We're the PFPU, so the Provincial Forensic Pathology Unit. But there's other units in Kingston, London, Sault Ste. Marie, Sudbury, Ottawa, and some of the community hospital. A lot of those are based out of community hospitals as well. We're the only one that has our own dedicated facility, to my knowledge. But the staff and the number of cases is not sufficiently high enough to require a forensic photography technologist. I believe out in Nova Scotia, one of the main forensic pathology unit out there has 2 staff photographers. I believe one is full-time, one is part-time. But apart from that, I don't know that anywhere else in Canada has what we have. And I mean, and our numbers are disproportionately higher, I think, than everyone else as well for our facility. I mean, in Ontario, there's about, give or take, 30,000 people that die every year, and about 30% of those 30,000 become coroner's cases. So they require an actual investigation. And then of that portion, 60% roughly come to us. So, and those those are old numbers. So, I don't know what they would currently be, but if they continue to climb, I don't see how they can avoid doing that for too much longer. Everywhere else, the pathologist assistants, which are the backbone, really, of the post-mortem exam. They do all the cutting, they do a lot of the heavy lifting, they take all the samples, and in the absence of any other specialists, they're doing the photos, they're taking the bodies in and out of the coolers. So in that way, we're unique, because we've put all the money into dedicated roles that have specific functions.
Okay.
So
I want to read something to you. It was actually from part of your abstract that you had submitted, and it actually, but it raises a really good point, and I think it touches on kind of what you're saying here. And part of it says that, the use of photography for the purpose of documenting postmortem examination has been in practice for several decades, and for most of that time has been considered an ancillary or secondary means of documentation, a function to support findings identified and recorded through other means. By extension, the role of the photographer has also been secondary, an individual who used their knowledge and expertise in recording an image to support the investigation or medical opinion of the pathologist at the direction of the subject matter expert. The modern autopsy requires more. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that was a really long sentence and maybe a little bit pretentious, but I think there's value in saying that. I think, again, the fact that my role exists at all is a testament to the fact that we need better documentation from people who are trained in at least the use of a camera, if not the use of a camera for biomedical imaging. So what's required now is, I think, a photographer who has a good understanding of anatomy and physiology, trauma, and can, literally and figuratively focus their lens on subjects with their own understanding of what they're looking at. They can be trying to look for things that maybe the pathologist can't see because they're not assisted by an IR or an IR capable camera, or using cross-polarization. We see thousands of cases a year, and we have kind of become accustomed to seeing things with a different eye. And that, I think, being able to leverage our ability in that way becomes a better investigative tool. We're able to think about things a little bit differently. We're able to get closer. We're able to find layered ways, I guess, of examining a particular finding. So one example is the use of infrared or cross-polarization as a survey tool, right? if it's just an ancillary process, right? The doctor looks for something, the pathologist assistant helps them find it, and once it's been examined and dissected, traditionally they would just call the photographer over, the police photographer typically, and say, "Can you take a photo of that?" Okay, great. So now we've just provided photographic support for something that they already found, right? So now we're just kind of the backup for a peer review a year later, 6 months later, by another professional. But what I'm suggesting is, if we use it as a survey tool, we can actually be looking for things that can't be seen because the body's too decomposed, or the body's too burnt, or the skin is too dark. And so if we're able to point out, hey, I don't know if you're able to appreciate this, but there's some bruising down here, or there's a tattoo and this person's unidentified. Prior to using infrared photography, for sure, absolutely, cases were coming in and out of the facility without an ID because we had no way to see these things. But now that, as the photographer, we're able to identify what modalities are going to be suitable for this particular case, we can start thinking about it that way. We're constantly kind of asking ourselves, should we, what lens are we going to use? What should we bother with IR for this case, or should we only use cross-polarization? If the tattoos are a particular color, we know that IR is not going to work. Or if the decomposition is a certain type, we know that cross-polarization won't work. So we really need to think about it that way. So we're not just a secondary tool. We're not just a backup. We're actually trying to integrate ourselves into the investigative process.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, you mentioned decomposition, but I just want to bring up like what some of the challenges are, because I mean, you're dealing with all manners of death, and some of them that are sort of difficult. So, burns. So people that are in fires, you talked about decomposition. So that could be in water, like a body that is, completely wet, and there could be other bodily fluids present. There could be, of course, liquids can cause reflections, and then all of a sudden you have just like, for example, I think you've mentioned once about competing tone and texture. So can you talk about some of the problems that the photographer has to face?
So when you got, in the case of, say, a body that, a death that has happened very recently, within 24 to 48 hours, before there's any likelihood of any, decomposition have set in, or any animal predation, or insect activity, there's a pretty good chance that what we see visually is also what the camera is going to see, and vice versa. But when you start dealing with cases where the individual has a very dark complexion, and it's possible that they may have tattoos. So the competing tone and texture is, the tone is the color, right? The tattoo is dark and the skin is dark. So now that tattoo, in order for us to visualize it, we have to work our way through the noise of the dark skin. Or the dark skin may also be coming from decompositional artifacts. So the skin starts to turn green and blue and brown. And there's particular spectral characteristics that are maintained with skin and tattoo ink that we're able to get past, but not in white light. So we need to think about using another imaging modality to bypass that. Competing textures would be, if you've got something that's got very small textured surface, say like cirrhotic liver, and we want to be able to document that. But because of the texture of the surface of the liver, which is very bumpy, the reflections are also going to be very they're not going to be uniform. It's not going to be a flat reflection. So trying to find an imaging modality that will get us past the reflections so that we can actually see what we want to see, the structures, the underlying structures. So that's really it, is just trying to kind of think about what imaging modalities we have and how they relate to the subject we're going to photograph. So be it dark skin, highly reflective, a body pulled from water is going to have its own variety of issues. But it really is decomposition, dark skin, thermal damage, and trying to find evidence of trauma, which is also often dark because bleeding becomes a dark patch. and yeah, the tattoos, body markings, that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, before we, I want to ask you about cross-polarization, IR, UV, and that sort of thing. But
Mhm.
the two things that I'd like to cover before that are the tech that you use, the software and the hardware. And maybe
Mhm.
let's start with the software. That might be easier to. But what kind of things are you doing or utilizing in terms of, or what kinds of things are you doing to the images after you've taken them? Are you doing anything with them? Are they just raw images? Like,
We shoot raw. We shoot raw plus JPEG, but the JPEGs are just backup. So everything we shoot is raw. We use an application called Adobe Lightroom.
mhm,
We, as part of kind of the forensic realm, we don't alter the images. So we process. So anything that would have traditionally been done in a dark room, we lighten, we darken, we color correct, we can crop. Uh, but we don't push pixels, we don't add or subtract anything, and that's really where you draw the line. Is we don't modify the images, we just non-destructively process the images and then create an export, a JPEG, which is what gets delivered to the pathologist and the stakeholders. So we always have, our massive imaging archive. I think we're on a 40 terabyte RAID, and we're almost halfway full. Um, and everything's kept there. But yeah, the processing is actually very little. And the nice thing about Lightroom is it does keep metadata, so it tells us what alterations have happened, and that file, the metadata file, travels with our images whenever they go to police or through any other FOI request. We pass everything along so that if they need to recreate all the steps to get the same to get to the same endpoint, they can do that. So yeah, to the question of software, there's actually not much. We that part of it is fairly easy. The more complicated thing is keeping track of where all the photos are going and making sure that the right photos are with the right cases. Hardware wise, I don't know if there was a specific thing you wanted me to talk about. I did mention that I had all the equipment kind of ready if you want to take a.
yeah, I think so. Like, and I don't want
Okay.
to, it's not a promotion for any one sort of
No, no, no.
technology or device, but I'm just curious about the kit, and what would you say, for example, would be like a minimum kit or standard that somebody should be having if they're going to be, taking these kinds of photographs in the autopsy room.
Yeah, and I think the kit is should pretty well be the same for just about any forensic professional, with some outliers. But I think generally every kit should have at this day and age at least a full frame camera. If not a full frame, then at least a modern mirrorless, like a 4/3 or something to that effect. But a full frame type camera, professional level would be ideal. A macro lens, we use a 50 mil. A zoom lens 24-70, which is kind of the standard, but you can get it to go as high and low as you want. And then I would highly recommend using a handheld flash, either connected to the camera via a sync cord or a remote, wireless remote of some kind. And then that kind of is the basic kit everyone, I think, should consider having. The additional things that make it easier is if you can get a ring light for your flash, your macro flash. It allows you to get much closer without winding up with weird shadows. You get still a very even light. And then if you really want to scale it up and get complex, like we have, we've applied on our system back there, we have a high temperature linear polarizing gel on the flash, and then a circular polarizing filter on the lens, which we set up for cross polarization. So they're set up basically orthogonally oriented to one another. And then for the handheld flash, so this one right here, you see that big bubble on top. We don't use that at work, but it's something I recommend to police services, that when you need more light, but you still want it to be cross polarized, it's just a mechanism that you can attach the polarization gel to the top of the flash so you can handhold it. And that's kind of, that would be kind of the extended kit. And then for IR, just having any infrared capable camera or a multispectral camera, full spectrum camera, sorry, with an IR filter, cutoff filter available for that particular lens, and then an illuminator that you can just kind of carry around. You can bring in closer, you can angle it however you need to. I mean, really, you could just kind of keep on going with each particular spectra and each type of finding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Gail's got a question here about, the type of camera that you're actually using. So I don't know if you can say or not, but
Oh yeah. I mean, it's definitely not not going to use it as a promotion. When I started, because all we had there was just a couple of old beat up Nikons, and I said, we can't keep using these. They're not going to provide the results you need. So what can we buy? I was just naturally assuming that we were going to go Nikon because everybody in policing seems to use Nikon, and one of our senior staff was responsible for making that call. Said, well, I don't know, what do you use at home? And I just happen to have Canon. And he said, well, if you're more comfortable with Canon, just get Canon. And so that just kind of got the ball rolling down the hill. And so now we're probably about 8 cameras deep. All of our lenses are Canon, and it was never intended to be either or. Nikon is incredible, and I would have been 100% happy and capable of using Nikon. It just didn't matter at the beginning because we were starting from scratch. And at that time, we didn't know if there would ever be more photographers. So it was the same reason we wound up on all Mac as well. It was that trust of you're the guy, you're the first guy, the first person. So what do you use? And if that's what you would recommend, then let's just do it. But like I said, now we're several cameras and several computers deep, and not that there's any need to jump in either direction. Canon's been great, and I personally enjoy it. And so to answer Gail's question, is the ones that we use at work are Canon 5D Mark IVs. I personally, what I've got running for my webcam right now is Canon R6 mirrorless. If you were going to start from scratch right now, or we're thinking about upgrading for your service or personally, I would recommend mirrorless all the way. I'm always going to love a DSLR, but they're just not as practical anymore. And I think you get a lot more from the mirrorless. That it's almost, for the individual photographer, it's almost unquantifiable the changes that are going to take place because you're shooting mirrorless. But either way, I mean, in terms of what brand of camera, Nikon, Canon, Fuji has an incredible system. I've worked with their XT systems. So any one of those three, I think you'd be absolutely fine going with.
okay. Hey, can you do a little bit of show and tell, David? The two lights that are behind you there, I'm just wondering if you could maybe explain what the difference between those two lights are and what you're using them for.
Yeah, so these I don't use at work. These I picked up personally because I want to head more into multispectral research. So this here is an IR floodlight, which is peaks at 840 nanometer, and it gives a really wide beam. So if you're doing a scene search, you don't have to worry about that little handheld illuminator like this. This will give you a lot more coverage. And then for ultraviolet, I've got this as a handheld illuminator, and this will do 395 and 365. But this is only 365, which is actually better because it's further out of the visible range. It means you don't, with your eyes, see very much of the original light. It's still hitting your eyes. It can still damage your eyes, but you're not seeing it. But what you're seeing is the fluorescence it's casting off through the Stokes shift. But what it's also great for, and what I actually use it for more, is UV reflectance. So when you're not trying to get things to fluoresce, but you're just trying to see what absorbs UV light, you can use that same light, the same in the same camera. But if you've got a UV filter applied, a UV cutoff filter that only allows you to see 365 and below, you're going to see actually a lot of things reflected that you wouldn't otherwise be seeing. I am covered in freckles, and you can't really see them right now in white light, but in ultraviolet, it looks like I'm burned. And so using a light like that, you can use it for Halloween as well. And that's actually what it was, what it's sold for on Amazon. But because I knew specifically that it peaks at 365, I wound up getting that, and it's been awesome. It's been fantastic. So, and
Excellent.
then I think that's about it for equipment. Just for a close up, if anyone else wants to see, this is the ring flash, right? So it just pops off, and it's just got this right here is just a gel that just sticks on, and with the circular polarizing filter on the front, it allows us to set it up in a cross-polarized configuration.
So let's talk about some of the techniques now. So you got the equipment. We talked about the, some of the software that you're using.
Mhm.
So, and it's sort of in three right now that I'm seeing. There's UV, there's IR, right, and then there's even cross polarization, which are probably the holy trinity of a
Yeah.
forensic photographer, let's say. And I'm curious about the choices that you make when you're at the autopsy of, hey, I need to use this, I need to do that, because as you say, sometimes you can't see what it is that's there, or maybe you understand that for a certain type of injury, you're like, oh, you know what, I need to grab UV in this case because I might have a better chance of using it. So can you talk a little bit about the decision process in your head about how you go through all this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I do have a decision tree workflow that I started working on during my time with the OPP that I am hoping to. I mean, I've already expanded on it and kind of hoping to at some point publish it. But basically, just the internal thought process is when the body bag is first opened and we see the decedent, the first things that are going off is, are they fair skinned? Are they dark skinned? Do they have a lot of trauma? Are they covered in any kind of any grease or mechanical fluids? Are they decomposed? Are they burned? And depending on what how they visually present, that will help us determine what type of visualization we're going to go for. So, for example, if someone is clothed in dark clothing, suspected gunshot wounds, they have a dark complexion, then we're going to go down one road first. We're going to be looking at the clothing using infrared, because photographing dark clothing in white light is pointless. So looking at it in infrared will allow us to see, in many cases, not all cases, it depends on the textile, but it will allow us to see if there's any gunshot residue, any patterns around any of the defects on the clothing where the blood might have pooled. Once we remove that clothing and we're down to the skin now, if the individual is identified, tattoos are not a concern. So we don't need to continue going with IR for the purpose of searching out tattoos. But we will continue to use IR if we're trying to see if there's any gunshot residue around a defect on the skin. Skin has a particular spectral response in infrared and white light that we leverage. Melanin is very reflective in infrared. So what that means is, where in white light, melanin will absorb a lot of light and will be quite dark. In infrared, it reflects much of that light back, and so it becomes very light. Where tattoo ink and gunshot residue and many mechanical fluids, they retain that infrared absorptive property. And so when we go into infrared, the two basically separate from one another. So where they overlap, that competing tone and color, they separate. And so it allows us to kind of continue down an investigative path with a particular tool. However, if we're also trying to document trauma, because say that individual was in a fist fight, 2 hours earlier, now infrared isn't going to work, because infrared, the way it interacts with hemochrome, or which is the main pigment that is responsible for the coloring of hemoglobin, myoglobin, it won't work anymore. The red that we're looking for in the bruising is now no longer visible. So we have to switch out from infrared and now move over to cross-polarization, because that will bypass the reflections from the condensation on the skin and actually get into the tissues and separate the dark skin from the dark bruising. And so we're able to determine where those injuries might have happened and keep them separate from the tattoos. The tattoos also turn out fantastically brilliant in cross-polarization, and actually retains a lot of the color information as well. but we use it for a different purpose. If there were, say, a different version of a story would be if an individual who was very fair-skinned came in and there was some indication in the history that they may have been confined or bound or restricted in some way. We can potentially use ultraviolet to look on the fair side of the skin, right, where there's you can barely see any detail anyways because the blood is pulled all the way to the back. But if there's an injury on the anterior portion of the neck, we can use ultraviolet to see whether there was anything. In this, when I say potential, I really mean potential because ultraviolet is a very difficult modality to use. But the potential for it is there, where we can see if there's any minute surface disruptions in the skin that wouldn't otherwise be visible in white light. And so, I've got a couple cases where that turned out to be the case, where there was some scarification that happened on an individual's back, and we could not, for the life of us, make it out because it was being obscured by lividity. And lividity is the gravity-dependent pooling of blood. And so, because the lividity was so dark, infrared was just going to make it transparent. So whatever we were trying to see through the blood would also become transparent because the skin was so light colored. Going for cross-polarization, that wouldn't help because that would only serve to increase the color and saturation of the blood, making it darker, again, interfering with being able to visualize the damage, the scarring on the skin. And so switching to ultraviolet, which was kind of a last ditch, it just jumped out, and so it was able to highlight the surface disruptions, and we were able to actually make out an individual's name, which had been carved into the decedent's back. And so, in this way, this theoretical of being able to find surface disruptions on the skin for the competing color and tone of fair skin is very different than what we would be doing for dark skin or burned skin. So that decision tree that you were just showing, that's the process I very loosely and very quickly go through in my head. But by no means, it's not set in stone. It's changed probably 10 times since I started it. But yeah, that's kind of the general idea.
Okay. When we talk about infrared, we're talking about 850 nanometer range, and then on the or are you using different range of filters, and what about on the UV range as well? Like, what are you using in terms of filters?
So for filters, the wavelengths we're using, when I first got the camera that we use for infrared it was converted for 720 nanometer just because that's all they had. And so I had purchased some additional filters that we could apply to it, additional cutoff filters for 840 and 695, I believe. But at the end of the day, what we're looking for is so specific, and both fall generally within the same range of 720. So we rarely use those additional filters, and we just have a single illuminator. And if we're not using room light because there's sufficient IR in the environment, if we need that additional boost of light, we use an 840 nanometer illuminator, and that works just fine, again, for highlighting what we're looking for. There's a lot of research in there that really needs to be done, I think. There's a lot of information that could be sought out and kind of more clearly defined based on the wavelengths. But for our purposes, we're doing a quick survey. Decedent comes in, we're just doing a walk around to say there's a tattoo here, tattoo there. There's what looks like a bruise in IR that we can't appreciate in white light. So maybe we need to take a closer look at that. And that's kind of how we're doing it.
Okay. There's a question from Alina here. So she's asking about, do you follow certain standards when you're working, or are you allowed to use any personal equipment for your source of light? I guess she's wondering if sometimes, you don't have something available and you need something. And I'm also thinking about a lot of agencies globally that may not be well funded, right? Like there's some people that are just, don't have a lot to work with.
Right. So in terms of standards, if anyone's written one, I don't know of it. We definitely don't follow specific standards yet. I know that there's been papers published, and I wish we had more time for that research, but we're such a high volume facility that we're just focused on operational requirements and just get it done. In terms of using personal equipment, I would say, honestly, if it works, go for it. I've been working with some funded services. One in particular, I don't want to name names because I don't know if they would appreciate that. But I've been working with one underfunded service in another part of the world where I was able to modify and send to them an infrared camera that would be suitable for their purposes. And it didn't follow any standard. I just knew that the system would work, and I knew that they needed an infrared camera that would allow them to visualize tattoos in the unidentified bodies that were coming in. And I would highly recommend that you get whatever equipment you can get your hands on, because at the end of the day, the reason we're doing this is in service of the public. We're trying to get these people identified. We're trying to help the investigation. If there's a specific standard and you can't find it, then it's not a great standard. So, Alina, if there's specific equipment that you think you can get access to and it will work for your purposes, I would suggest just using it. And if at some point down the road a standard comes into place, or it becomes a standard that you yourself are creating, then all the better. But for now, just whatever works.
Dave, I want to bring up a couple of images here if I can. And these are images that you've taken. And if you can, there may be two or three or four we might be able to squeeze in here. But if you can briefly give us just sort of the challenge of the photo or the meaning of the photo and what we're looking at, that'd be great.
Okay. And I have to say it, that I obviously can't discuss any case specifics. It should almost go without saying. But I'll do my best to describe it without getting too in depth. So what we're looking at here is the posterior aspect of an eye. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a pair of forceps, and it's actually holding onto the optic nerve at the back of the eye. And so this eye was opened at autopsy to look for the presence of possible retinal hemorrhages, which are present as these kind of small, round, reddish spots that are overlapping some of the vessels there. And the reason this finding was relevant is this particular case was an individual of a child had died due to a fatal crush injury of the skull. And unfortunately, the large object which caused that injury caused sufficient pressure in the skull and in the eyes to cause these retinal hemorrhages to appear. Our chief, and this was very early on for me, so I barely even knew what I was looking at the time, but our chief had asked me to document these findings as well as possible, because they were highly relevant to this case, because classically, it was thought that these retinal hemorrhages would only appear in shaken baby syndrome. And what he was trying to demonstrate with the photo is that we know clearly that it can happen through other means, other traumatic means. It was a terrible accident, and obviously a tragedy, but no one was criminally responsible. It was simply an accident. And so being able to demonstrate that finding in an accidental case was key to saying to other individuals that this particular finding, which was classically thought to only be from a particular mechanism, is actually possible through other means. And so when I took that photo, the difficulty of it was basically that these structures were floating, and once you pull them out of fluid, out of the vitreous, they just kind of collapse. And they were also very shiny. So we had to go through the process of submerging them and shooting them in the water. And the light had to actually come in from the side of the container in order to illuminate it properly. So it took about 20 minutes to get it properly.
Yeah, unfortunately, people who are going to be listening to the podcast are not going to be able to appreciate the images. So I'm going to have to say, hey, when you get a chance, just jump on the YouTube channel. But let's talk about this one. This is a beautiful, beautiful photo here. What are we looking at?
So this is blue ironstone on the metatarsal, foot bone. It's otherwise known as vivianite. And so these crystals are, my understanding of the chemistry behind it is that these crystals form as a byproduct of the chemical reaction between human tissue decomposing in a microenvironment of iron-rich water. And so what happens is when the decompositional products from tissue interact with the iron-rich water, it causes these crystals to form. And when they form, they're actually just white, they're clear. And it's not until the crystals and whatever they're sitting on are exposed to air that they oxidize and turn blue. So the story behind this, I unfortunately can't get into it, but it's very interesting. It's historical even. And the microenvironment itself was very interesting. But yeah, what jumped out to me about it, and again, this was very early on, was when our forensic anthropologist saw this, and she said, "I'm not sure what this is." Initially, she did find out. She said, "I'm not sure what this is. I've never seen it before, and I'm not likely to see it again." That to this day is still my clue. I need to take a photo of this because otherwise it's gone forever.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Let me bring up another image here. How about this one here? This looks like part of a mandible, but I can see it's darkened on one side there.
Yeah. So whenever we have whenever we have bodies recovered from a fire, there's a chance, depending on the severity of the fire, that the remains could be heavily disrupted, fractured, and in worst cases, they can be commingled with the remains of another individual. So part of the process for the forensic anthropologist is, first off, trying to separate the bones, the remains, the human remains, from debris or remains of non-animal or what have you. And once they're separated out, then becomes the jigsaw puzzle of trying to put them all back together and determine what body they belong to and do they fit together. So in this particular case, the upper and lower left mandible were charred and fractured, and at some point separated and burned separately. And so when our forensic anthropologist was able to put them together, she asked me to document it, to basically illustrate to anyone else that although they appear to be different, they've been burned separately. They do physically fit together, and so the jigsaw puzzle of that particular bone is that they belong to the same body.
Okay. I'm going to bring this one up here because, and this one here has a little bit of a story behind it, in the sense that this was for the Biocommunications Association, for which there are a lot of the people who were at the Forensic Photography Symposium are members. So like Tom Vadney and Ted Kinsman, Gail Spring. So this was a winner of a competition, right?
Yeah, it was kind of a fluke. I hadn't heard about the BCA until I saw it come up on your feed this past summer 2022. And I thought, wow, what a cool organization to be part of. So I applied to become a member, and then I saw that there was a competition, and had to go through a big, long process of asking to see if we could even submit anything. Because my personal feeling up until this past year was, I don't like the idea of using images of casework. I mean, this is someone's loved one for a competition. But 11 years on now, I realize that there's also nobody seeing what we do, what we're capable of. And that in and of itself is also a shame, that there is a beauty to what we're seeing. And so I applied for and asked for the opportunity to submit some images to kind of demonstrate what we do at the OFPS. And when I was granted permission, I submitted a bunch. And I was just happy to get anything in there. And so when I was informed that that I actually won the premier award for the biomedical category, in addition to like 3 others, I was kind of blown away. So this one in particular, cerebral reflections, what we're looking at in the center is the ventral surface, so the underside of a brain. And that accumulation of blood in the bottom portion is not supposed to be there. That's as a result of what's suspected at this time to be ruptured Barry aneurysm. And it's kind of accumulated together in a clump because it's still in the subarachnoid, under the subarachnoid, or it's in the subarachnoid space. And so whenever a body is going through the examination process, each organ is pulled out and weighed separately. So when they transfer the brain to the bowl, I was already there waiting for the brain to wind up on the grossing table. And when I saw it in there, I just thought, might make for an interesting photo. And I took the shot, forgetting actually that I had the cross-polarization set up already on the camera. And so what happened was the reflection on the underside of the brain is non-existent. You don't see any of the light being reflected from that surface, but the light became depolarized as it bounced off and hit the side of the bowl. and so that's why you only see the reflection of light from the bowl and not the brain itself. So it was a photo of opportunity.
That's great. Great images here, all of them. Let me ask you about, because I see we could probably talk here. We're already at an hour almost, and I haven't even gotten through some of my questions here. But I want to ask you about the scalability of what you guys have done at the OFPS. So, for example, you said you started off by yourself, and I'm assuming that a lot of people are probably going to be in that situation. They just,
Yeah.
they're satellites, they work on their own.
Yeah.
But when we talk about scalability, I don't just mean, there's now 3 or 4 people, but also what happens when you have some kind of a massive disaster, you have some kind of a massive shooting, and you have to deal with a very large number of images with a number of different people. Can you talk about some of that?
So, yeah, I'd love to. I just want to preface with I haven't received any formal training in mass fatality yet. That's definitely an area I'm very interested in pursuing more training. But scaling it from what we do internally, whenever I've discussed our setup that we use at the OFPS with individuals who have undergone that training, the ears kind of perk up when I tell them, yeah, all the shooting that we do, it's wireless. As we shoot at each table, the images are being sent to our imaging server where we can process them remotely. So we don't need to be in our office. We don't need to be where our server is. We never have to take the cards out of our camera. The images are basically backed up on the card, and we can back those up whenever we need to down the road. But it's all happening wirelessly. And everything that we're sending from our camera to our system is being tagged with the camera it's coming from, copyright information, and we can even scale that up theoretically to include GIS information as well. So I got to thinking that we went from using 3 cameras or 4 cameras and pulling the card out in this really slow, inefficient method where it was prone to overwriting particular files because they happen to be named the same, to based on Miami-Dade's 11, 12-year-old document that I was given by Heidi Nichols years ago. I based the system that we use now on that essentially. And what it allows us to do is our cameras communicate to our system via FTP locally. So it's not over the internet. It's just all on an internal network. But it allows us to just run and gun. We just shoot and it's automatically being sent. When we have the time, we come back and process the photos by remotely accessing a computer in a different part of the building. And so what I got to thinking was scalability. If we needed to deploy 8 of these or 10 of these or a dozen, 20 of these cameras to the field at the site of a mass fatality, a plane crash, something to that effect, without having to continuously run the cards back for processing, having an additional person having to back all those cards up and manage the images. I am kind of trying to work on a framework for being able to do this in a much more structured way that's scalable, with each portion of the process broken up by the roles and duties that are needed for that particular thing. So the field photographers don't have to worry about getting the camera and getting the card back to the processing station. They're already being transferred wirelessly. The ID people are running their own system, cataloging their own images, being fed into the same system, but they don't need to be interacting with anyone else. It doesn't need to be centralized through any particular person or role. It's all being fed into the same system. And with the appropriate level of infrastructure applied to it, I think it can scale up pretty well.
Okay. You just mentioned before you hadn't been trained for mass casualty, but that brings up another topic, which is training. And so what is your impression about the type of training that most people receive when it comes to photography?
I'm trying to be diplomatic about this. It's insufficient. It's insufficient. And I feel for the officers I've trained, because they do this job in the field under a lot of pressure, with the expectation that these photos are going to be perfect every time. And the level of training that they receive is not sufficient to meet that expectation. My understanding is that they're trained how to use their firearm much more frequently and required to validate or to requalify on that use every year. But once they're taught how to use a camera, there's no follow-up to that. When I started and I was asking police officers, so why do you take those photographs, or how do you take that particular photo that you're doing? The response I got was, oh, this is just what my training officer showed me, but there's no backup for why you did it. There's no, well, if you're noticing that that particular image is always dark, why aren't you adjusting it? And the response is, we don't really know how. We don't know what we're doing wrong. And so one of the things I'm hoping to do next is really push more towards into training. So just trying to get as much information about what we do, our small slice of the pie, but also the use of a camera in general, out to police officers and other stakeholders, sexual assault nurse examiners. Clinically, this is a big deal. Like they need better support in photography training. They're dealing with victims that could still be helped, and it's awful when the photos that they're able to take are insufficient to be used in criminal proceedings. So I'm kind of getting to a point where I feel almost personally responsible now. So I'm just trying to get it out there.
Yeah. Are you, and now as part of your role as a photographer, does
Mhm.
does your agency support the training sometimes, or do you do stuff separately on your own? Like,
There's, again, to be diplomatic, there's a degree of support that happens within the forensic pathology field. So if other forensic pathology services are specifically asking for training in forensic post-mortem photography, yes, it's granted. But to train police, that's not technically part of our role. So there's support in that, yes, we'll give you the time you need to do it, but it's not something we're actively encouraged to do through our job. And again, a lot of it comes down to operational needs. We're so busy that we barely have the time to do the work we need to do. So whenever I can, I run courses. I ran a course last year. I'm hoping to do a couple more this year. I'm going to be giving a lecture at OFIA. Whatever training comes up.
okay. OFIA is Ontario Forensic Investigators Association. That's a conference that's up in, oh boy, is that May? I don't remember the date now.
Yeah,
but
May. I'm there on May 4th for the day. And that's taking place in Niagara this year.
Okay. Hey, so Dave, I want to ask you about research. I want to ask you about
Mm.
kinds of things you're working on right now and looking forward and ahead. Like what's next for you? What kinds of things are you sort of diving into right now?
The next big thing for me, and I think the next big thing really in forensic photography, is computational photography. I mean, this is kind of your bread and butter. And I think that's a point, that's an aspect of the field that we're really missing out on. And it just comes down to, we just don't have the time. So I'm trying to carve out the time for myself to learn more about how we could apply computational photography to postmortem exams. But kind of more holistically, what I'm looking for is there's three general areas that I want to focus on: is pre-autopsy, during autopsy, and post-autopsy. And for pre-autopsy, it's enhanced death scene photography. So putting more of what we do at the postmortem, that knowledge, putting it in the hands of the police officers and the investigators responsible for those investigations. So that means, expanded spectrum surveys for clinical and postmortem scenes, as well as applying some of those aspects to shooting and blood scene if they're applicable. During autopsy, what I think where it'll happen first, hopefully, is with us. But again, really solidifying the idea of an expanded spectrum survey before we start our photography. I'm hoping to be able to integrate 3D multispectral scanning at some point, drawing on the expertise of Soren out in Zurich. And trying to take the multispectral photography, but push it up to the 3D level, and creating models that we could at some point merge with our CT images. And one kind of incidental benefit to this that I hadn't considered, because we do so much of this, I don't want to say we become numb, because we definitely don't, but we become accustomed to seeing these kinds of things. The people that have to review these cases, and especially who have to look at them in court, they're not used to seeing what we see, and it's unreasonable for us as the investigators to expect them to see what we see and not suffer because of it. So there's been an increasing push, and I think Dr. Alfredo Walker has addressed this in the past, saying that there's an increased need for 3D representation, not photographs, but sanitized versions of what we see that just basically illustrate the anatomy and the particular injury without all the blood and the gore and the violence associated. So that, for me, again, means a lot to be able to kind of take that away from, take that potential for injury away from people who don't do what we do by introducing computational photography. And then post-autopsy, the 3D scanning of remains for archiving. We have a lot of unidentified remains that we're trying to work through. So I was thinking it would be great if we could create a 3D archive of these remains instead of two-dimensional, and also for identification. Again, kind of blue skying it. If you've got a plane crash where the decedents are all from another country, we're not going to have any of the records here. But if we can produce 3D scans of the individuals, of their dentition, of other relevant identifying features, and get those 3D models as opposed to two-dimensional photographs, which are sometimes, as you well know, are very difficult to interpret, especially under stress. That would be, I think, a great thing we can do. And then beyond that, it also just keeps coming back to training, and training and research. I had a whole sheet of training and research ideas that I won't talk about today, but there's a lot there. There's stuff I haven't even touched on, but yeah, it just comes down to training. Like, what more can we do with the tools we have, and if we don't have the tools, what tools do we need to see more?
Okay. Another question that I meant to ask you, which had to do, and you sort of touched on it here, about the fact that some of these images and such, people are not used to seeing. But how do you handle the graphic nature of just being at the autopsy and seeing what you have to see, and sometimes just the trauma, and working with, obviously, children or whoever happens to come by the office there? It's been a topic of discussion in some of the previous talks last week with Dr. Richard Shepard, another one that I did with Douglas Young, talking about emotional wellness, right? So how do you manage that?
I mean, there's how do I personally manage it versus us as an organization? On an individual level, I guess we'll start with the organization. As an organization, the kind of work we do, it's in a controlled environment. There's no sirens. There's no people screaming. There's no the stress and the pressure of being actually at the death scene is not there for us. And so we kind of we roll with that, in knowing that we ourselves are safe from the primary risk of the scene. And so by the time we receive the decedent, therapy's already been applied. The injuries are still very, very visible. I mean, of course, they are what they are. And for the most part, being in that controlled environment with your colleagues is able to provide us a degree of safety and security, mentally and physically. But what I've realized over the years is that while you're able to manage them on an individual basis, it's the sheer volume, I think, that for me personally has become the difficult part to manage. You build up a certain level, a certain threshold of every case is awful because someone's had to die for you to have your job, for you to be able to do your job. And so in that respect, every case is awful. But there's certain, what I call breakthrough cases, where when you see them, you know that this particular case is going to stick with you and you may never forget it. And those cases take an additional level of management, I guess, for lack of a better term. We all have our ways of compartmentalizing. And I think there's a lot of external factors which come into play for our ability to appropriately compartmentalize what we see. But when we get those breakthrough cases, and it's going to be different for everyone. For me, definitely, it's children. I've got 3 of my own, and so when you see the things that have happened to other people's children, it's heartbreaking, and it can become very difficult to manage. So going from an organizational standpoint, a lot of it comes down to we're just there for one another, not in any formalized way. But I think if anyone is having a difficult time managing what we're doing, I would hope that we would be able to support one another. But strangely enough, as of yet, as an organization, we don't have any formalized process for preventative support or post-incident support. We have phone numbers we can call. We have other processes we can follow, but it's not. I feel like there's we could probably be doing more. And then on an individual basis, like I said, you handle it until you can't. And for me, tail end of 2020 was particularly bad, and there were a couple of cases that impacted me much more severely than I had anticipated. Mm-hmm. And stress leave is what you got to do sometimes, and then you just find ways to kind of cope with it and move forward, and hope that next time something like that happens, you have a better set of tools to manage it.
Yeah, well, it's a big topic, and it's really important that these days. I think people are under a lot of stress as it is. Sometimes it's not even the casework. Sometimes it's management, or or colleagues, or the work environment, or whatever, right? So that sometimes that can be difficult to manage too. But Dave, can I put up your LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, please.
That's okay. All right. Well, look, folks, if you want to get a hold of David, I'm going to that's his name, put it up there, big there, and he is on LinkedIn. So that's the best way to reach him. Just reach out to him. Dave, I know you're usually very good about people asking questions and helping out. Heck, he'll even send you an infrared camera. He'll build you one. There you go. So, well, look, Dave, I want to say thank you so much for being here today.
That was my pleasure.
Always an honor to have you. Great information. Thank you so much for the support on the Forensic Photography Symposium, and I'm looking forward to doing some more with you in the future.
Yeah, and to anyone listening, thank you very much for taking the time to check it out. And I love meeting anyone else around the world that does not just what I do, but what any of us do. And if there's any way I can provide support, and honestly, I love learning, so I always want to know how other people do what we do, because I didn't have anyone specific to learn from or to teach me. So I have no idea if I'm doing things the right way. I would just hope that by now I've hopefully figured it out. So thank you very much.
All right. Hey, Dave, all the best. Hang back, and we'll chat with you soon. Okay. Stand by.
Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, that does it for this one. Another episode. Don't forget, we are having the photogrammetry training next week, March 14 and 15. I saw 1 or 2 people who are in the comments here who are going to be there next week. So looking forward to having you. Also, the Recon 3D user group meeting, very first user group meeting, going to bring the Recon 3D users together, talk about 3D, talk about techniques, talk about accuracy, tips and tricks, and some prize giveaways too. We will be back next week. And next week, I'm going to have Dr. Itiel Dror. We're going to be talking about, continuing on, it's been like 3 weeks talking about pathology, but we are going to be talking about one paper in particular that he's published having to do with bias in, forensic pathology, which I think is going to be pretty interesting. He's a returning guest, but super knowledgeable, and he brings up a lot of important points. So on that, I want to say thanks very much, everyone. I want to wish you a happy Thursday, and we shall see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.